Everybody speaks in Bangla or understands Bangla. I can. Bangla বুঝি. Good. তাহলে আমরা we can mix languages. And যারা presenter, you can also feel free যেভাবে communicate করতে comfortable feel করা হয়. আমার উপরে যেহেতু কোনো restriction দেওয়া হয়নি, so I'm assuming that I can switch between languages. আমাদের আজকের এই সেশনে ওয়েলকাম টু অল এসএমই প্রোডাক্টিভিটি ফাইন্যান্সিং অ্যান্ড উইমেন এন্টারপ্রেনারশিপ তিনটা ডিফারেন্ট পেপার আছে কাজী ইকবাল লুকস ইনটু দ্য ক্লাস্টার নন ক্লাস্টার কম্পারিজন যেটা সাথে প্রোডাক্টিভিটি ইস্যু লিঙ্ক আপ করা হচ্ছে অ্যান্ড দেন দেয়ার ইজ লোকাল ফাইন্যান্সিয়াল ডেভেলপমেন্ট অ্যাক্সেস টু ক্রেডিট এটা ডিফারেন্ট কাইন্ড অফ ডেটা সেট ব্যবহার করে মনজুরের অ্যান্ড হিজ কলিগ দে উইল বি প্রেজেন্টিং যেটা লার্জলি টু ডু উইথ ব্যাংক ব্রাঞ্চ এক্সপেনশনের সাথে কিভাবে রিস্ক রিডিউসড হতে পারে এবং সেই কারণে এক্সপেনশন অফ দ্য ফাইন্যান্সিয়াল ইনক্লুশন ঘটতে পারে অ্যান্ড থার্ড ইজ অন উইমেন এন্টারপ্রেনারশিপ যেটা ইকবাল উইল বি রিপ্রেজেন্টিং দ্য গ্রুপ অফ অথর্স আমি খুব টাইমটাকে এইভাবে এগোচ্ছি যে ইচ স্পিকার হ্যাজ রাফলি 15 মিনিটস ফলোড বাই দুজন ডিসকাসেন্টের একজন আমাদের সাথে আছে শুভাশিস we are waiting for Bashar. Hopefully he will arrive before ওই টাইমটা আসে and then we'll open the floor with minor interventions from me and then go back to the speakers to respond to the queries. So it's Kazi Iqbal on cluster versus non-cluster SMEs.
Okay, thank you, Chair. Okay, this paper is about cluster-based SME development in Bangladesh. In this paper, we compare the structure and the performance of the clustered SME with non-clustered SME, and also we try to identify the potential benefits of being in a cluster. So this is a work in progress, so your comments will be highly appreciated. This work is co-authored with Zabid Iqbal, Ferdous, Pabon, and Kazi Toufique. Motivation, as you know, these SMEs have significant impact on economic growth through employment generation and also value addition. These SMEs are also an integral part of the rural non-farm, and which also helps reduce poverty. These SMEs and informal enterprises accounted for about 60% of the GDP and 70% of the total employment of low-income countries, and 70% of GDP and 95% of total employment of middle-income countries. In case of Bangladesh, these SMEs account for about 51% of the country's industrial establishment, 35.5% industrial employment, and 47% of the industrial gross value. So these SMEs play an important role in generating income and reducing poverty. So as a result, the government of Bangladesh has been pursuing a host of policies to promote SMEs. And one of the most dominant policies is the cluster-based SMEs, because this cluster reduces, the cluster-based policy reduces the intervention cost of the government significantly, because because they are easier to locate, and also they have associations. Since they have associations, the government can easily negotiate with them. Our 7-5-year plan also underscored the importance of this cluster, and they said this is the agglomeration of co-located industries that they put emphasis on. Also, the SME foundations already identified 177 SME clusters. Apart from lower administrative costs, there are other benefits that the farms enjoy. And you know that the industries tend to agglomerate endogenously. That means they try to locate next to each other to derive some economies of scale. And there are three major sources of economic scale: sharing, matching, and learning. Sharing, this clustering gives opportunity to share indivisible goods. Say, for example, the farms share a big capital machine like boiler machine or effluent treatment plant, or even intermediate goods or transports. In case of matching, is mostly the labor market matching. There are other matching in case of other inputs. And it is argued that the number of job seekers and the vacancies may be in equilibrium much quicker in clustered area than non-clustered areas. And also it is found that a smaller proportion of input will remain idle within a cluster. So the wastage is limited in clustered areas. Learning firms tend to learn from each other, and they learn from each other when they are next to each other more, and which facilitates knowledge spillovers. And also it is argued that the transfer of knowledge and business knowledge can easily be done within the cluster. So given this context, we ask two important questions. Are the clustered SMEs different from the non-clustered SMEs? Or in particular, are the clustered SMEs more productive? And if positive, these two Marshallian externalities, that means matching, sharing, and learning, play any role or not? Excuse me, I got very bad cold. Literature review. There's a huge literature on the benefits of clustering, both theoretical and empirical, and hence I will shed light on only a few which have strong bearing on my work. For example, Lal et al., using Indian data, they found economies of scale at the farm level from improved access to market center, also at the industry level from intra-industry localization economies, and at the regional level from the intra-industry urbanization economies. Ruan and Jiang in 2000 EDCC paper, they found that in China, through clustering, an integral production process can be divided into many incremental steps, and that's the source of the economies of scale. Visa, they studied a cluster in Peru and found that cost reduction and information spills over are the dominant type of advantages. In Chinese, Blue Jeans experience show the role of local cluster in global value chains. Harris, they studied a handicraft cluster in Nairobi and found existence of important agglomeration economies, but this benefits is reduced due to informality. Excuse me, sorry. Sampling, there are 500 samples, of which 250 are clusters and 250 are non-clusters. There are 15 clusters: leather, garments, jamdani, plastic, hosiery, light engineering, rice mill, electronic and electrical goods, home textile, agarbatti, cricket bat, and nokshikatha. Let's take an example, for example, leather. Leather cluster is located in Bhairab in Kisharganj district. There are 2,500 enterprises, of which we surveyed 44 of them. And this is a proportional sampling. Excuse me. But the challenge is to find out the non-cluster SME, how to find the non-cluster SME. In this case, we took help from local associations, say leather manufacturing associations or leather associations, and also SME Foundation. They helped us find out the SMEs which are not in the cluster, but in that Bhairab sub-district or even in the Kisharganj district. And the number of non-clustered sample is the same as clustered sample. So in this case, this is also 44. Comparison of clustered and non-clustered SMEs, structure and size. If we look at the table, you see that the stock of capital is much higher for cluster SME than the non-cluster SME. It's 9 lakh versus 5 lakh, and the difference is statistically significant. In case of total employment, there is not much difference, 17.8 and 16.4. Total output is much higher for SME cluster. It's like 76 lakhs versus 54 lakhs. And the difference is statistically significant. And the capital labor ratio, cluster SME is much higher than non-cluster SME. So we can summarize that the cluster SMEs are larger than the non-cluster SMEs in terms of capital stock and output, but not in terms of labor employment. And also cluster SMEs are more capital intensive. Access to credit, total outstanding loan is much higher for cluster SMEs than the non-clusters, and it makes sense because cluster SMEs are larger than the non-cluster SMEs. Average rate of interest is slightly higher for non-cluster SMEs, but the difference is not statistically significant. Major source of credit, most of the SMEs took loan from SME loan from bank. this figure is 20%. And for non-cluster SME, this is only 6%, and the difference is statistically significant. And another significant source is the NGOs. And more non-cluster SMEs took loan from NGOs than the cluster SMEs, and the difference is statistically significant. We also asked question about the extent of ease the credit is available, and in this case, the SME loan stands out, and this is higher for SME cluster. Technology adoption. Excuse me. We asked whether the firm purchased any new machine in the last 5 years, whether the new machine replaced an old one, also the degree of replacement, and all these cases we didn't find any significant difference between cluster and non-cluster SMEs. Extent of formalities, most of the firms are single ownership firms, both cluster and non-cluster. There are a few joint ownership. And about 91% of the cluster SMEs are registered, whereas only 67% of non-cluster and non-registered are registered. And they received a license from city corporation, municipalities, and union councils. About 82% of the cluster SMEs are the member of the association, whereas only 9% of non-cluster SMEs are the member of the association. There are only few firms that have written contract for permanent employees. Only 12 of the total sample have written contract. 8 from cluster SME and only 4 from non-cluster SME. In case of oral contract for permanent employees, it's 2005 versus 2006, so there is no significant difference between them. Okay, now the question is, second question is, if the TFP hired for clustered SMEs or not. In this case, we estimate Cobb-Douglas production function, capital, labor, and raw material. And the estimated residual is our TFP, and you see the result here. And we are also aware of the endogeneity problem, but we are not into it right now. Then we regress the TFP on the cluster dummy, whether the firm is clustered or non-clustered, controlling for size and sector. And you see that we start with the most parsimonious specification, then we add on other controls. And we see that TFP is about 10 to 11% higher for clustered SMEs. Now we move on to the source of productivity difference, whether Marshallian externalities have any role or not. So we start with some descriptive statistics. We asked whether the firms share any machine, whether they share any labor, transport, or raw materials. And if they shared, what is the degree of sharing? And we asked them to scale it between 1 to 5. And we found that in case of sharing labor and transport, there is a significant difference between SME cluster and non-cluster SMEs. And in case of degree of sharing, we also found that in case of transport and raw materials, there is a significant difference. In case of matching, we asked the number of days taken to find labor and number of days taken to find non-labor. We also asked about the extent of which the firm find labor and non-labor. And in the first cases, there is no significant difference, but in case of ease of finding labor, we find significant difference between non-labor inputs between cluster SME and non-cluster SME. In case of learning, we found significant difference between cluster and non-cluster SMEs in case of business-related knowledge and skill-related knowledge. And in both cases, they are higher for cluster SMEs. But in the second panel, in the second question, whether if learned, what is the degree of learning? In case of degree of learning, we didn't see much differences. Then for more robust analysis, we regress these Marshallian externalities on whether the firm is clustered or not, controlling for size and sector. Our first dependent variable is if the firm shared anything, any capital or labor, raw materials, transport, or anything. And in this case, we find that the cluster variable is highly significant at about 2% level. So we see that cluster SMEs share significantly higher than non-cluster SMEs. In case of matching, the dependent variable is the number of days taken to find suitable labor, and we didn't find any significant difference. the coefficient is not significant. In case of learning, the dependent variable is if the firm learn anything, the technological knowledge, skill-related knowledge, or business process-related knowledge. And we find a strong correlation between learning and the clustered SMEs because the coefficient is highly significant at less than 1% level. So let's conclude. So SMEs in our clusters are larger. They are more capital intensive. They have greater access to banks' SME credit. They are more formal. Their productivity is higher, controlling for their size, technology, and sectors. And also Marshallian externalities such as sharing and learning might play a role in productivity differences. And we conclude that since there is some externalities, it justifies a policy for policy of protection to allow and also encourage clusters to emerge. Thank you.
Thank you, Iqbal. We straight away go to the next paper by Monzur, to be presented by Monzur on local financial development, access to credit, and SME performance. Evidence from Bangladesh, written by Monzur, Naoyuki, and Farhad. Monzur.
Thank you, Chair. Good afternoon. This paper, as you see the title, we are trying to see whether any types of local financial development matters for access to finance for SMEs and as well as their performances. You may know that SMEs are still mainly constrained by finance, formal finance, and it is not only true for Bangladesh, it is all over the world. The reason is very clear because they are not creditworthy in terms of they do not have enough collateral requirements, they do not have enough other technological support, education, or many other things. So in this paper, we have tried to develop a new thing or tried to show something which is a bit different from what we know. We try to relate whether local financial development, particularly we take local financial development in terms of bank branch expansion. The reason is that when we talk about access to finance, this is all about the formal finance. Formal finance, and therefore we consider the bank branch growth. It could be one of the determinants for access to finance. So we have written, I have written this paper with two of my colleagues. One is Professor Naoyuki Yoshino, he is the Dean of Asian Development Bank Institute, Tokyo, and other one is Farhad, he is the faculty of Waseda University. The context, I am just going through my So the main context is for writing this paper is that SMEs growth and operations are largely affected by lower access to formal credit. That's why in many countries they are developing many innovative instruments to help SMEs to get access to finance without collateral or without other things. And in Bangladesh, situation is about 69%. 69% of small enterprises and 45% of medium enterprises are constrained by finance. It was revealed in a survey conducted in 2013, and we are using the same data set. It was the data set of Inspire survey of European Union. They conducted this survey for about 1,200 manufacturing enterprises all over the Bangladesh. So we have used the same data. And why SMEs are not getting the due credit? There are various supply side constraints. In many papers, it has been revealed. For example, market imperfections, asymmetry of information, institutional deficiencies, lower level of financial development, and some of the supply side constraints. I am not elaborating the demand side constraints because we are dealing with the supply side issues. And a recent paper written by Pepchamp and Snowden in 2013, they also showed that local financial development could ease access to finance for SMEs. So therefore, this paper tests whether local financial development through bank branch network expansion could improve access to credit and SME performances. Why we are thinking about local financial development? Local financial development means we are trying to capture financial development in a local area community. Particularly, we consider here Thana level analysis. We are trying to assess whether any financial development in a Thana, it could help the SMEs in that local area. The reason is that, as I already said, as an indicator of local financial development, we consider bank branch expansion in area. Our data is about 2010 and 2012 about the bank branch expansion. How local financial development could help SMEs to get access? There is a bank competition hypothesis. This hypothesis says that if there are higher number of bank branches in a local area, there will be in a competition to find good borrowers. And for that reason, sometimes SMEs can get easy access to credit because of banks competition, they try to find good borrowers, they try to develop relationship with the firms, and then they could relax some constraints or relax some conditions like collateral requirements and other things. So this could facilitate financing through reducing asymmetry of information, as well as it reduces default risk ratio or default risk premium. This is the main theme of this paper. This paper is developed, we have developed a simple theoretical model which could be the basis of, which could be the building block of our financial, of our empirical analysis. I am not going to discuss all these things. These are the basic things of about SMEs in Bangladesh. Even financial development, our situation is not that much good. We have 57 banks. About 60% adults having a bank account, though it includes some farmers' account. I think these are almost dormant. If we exclude that, maybe 40% of adults could have bank accounts. Anyway, now I'm going to discuss a bit our theoretical model. This model develops to loan supply and demand function. First of all, loan supply function. If you see the first bank profit function equation, the right side you see RL is the lending interest rate, LS is the loan supplied by the banks. The next component is rho B. Rho is the default risk ratio, and which is a function of bank branch. And LS, as I already said, is a loan supplied. RD is the deposit rate, D is deposit, and the last component is the cost function of the banks. And so assuming that loan supply is equal to deposit, then we would come up with the final equation you can see. For the loan supply is a function of, you see, RL minus rho minus RD. That means if you don't think about a rho, then RL minus RD, that's the spread of interest rate. So if it is about SME, then bank usually adds some more premium to give them in loan. That is, their interest rate is higher than normal large firms' interest rate. That is rho, which is a function of bank branch. Because if bank branch is increasing in an area, we would say that rho will be declining because they will find good borrowers through relationship banking and other things. Next one is the demand function, loan demand function. This comes from the farm side. So this is a Cobb-Douglas production function. We defined this in this way, where population maybe you can think of labor, and K is the capital, that is here credit, which is also a function of rho and B. I mean default risk and also bank branches. So finally the equation takes this form. And last demand function, you will see that it comes to this point. So loan demand is also negatively associated with lending interest rate. And then you will see population means here population, you may consider also labor, you may consider Rho is the default risk, as well as bank branches. So this is the main building block of our analysis, empirical analysis. And then we have tested these two equations using seemingly unrelated regression with our data set. You see, since we do not have deposit information, that's why we use collateral and a spread. And then you see that in both equations, we find that a spread is positive to loan demand, loan supply. On the other hand, as expected, the interest rate, the lending interest rate is negative. Also the rho, the default risk, that is also negative. This is the main issues of our analysis. Because if bank branch increases, we expect that default risk will reduce. And if we add the bank branch growth, in the second model, you see that deposit rho is becoming a bit lower, and also the interest rate. That means bank branch helps come out of this situation a bit, not very significantly here. So the data, as I said, we have used the data of 1,000. Finally, we have a standard 1,084 farms because we have to match with the thanas. Out of 1,200, 72 thanas were there among 16 districts. And bank branch data we have used from Bangladesh Bank for 3 years, 2010, 11, 12. And thana characteristics are taken from highest data and the census combined. So the estimation strategy is to see whether bank branch growth facilitates the farm performance in terms of revenue, profit, and other things. So the main challenge of this empirical analysis is the endogenous placement of bank branch in an area. Usually bank open up its branch in a place where business grows. So if we want to estimate the impact of bank branch, then we have to encounter these endogeneity issues. So we have tried to use instrumental variable regressions. We have used two instruments. One is population density, and the other one distance to Dhaka from the Thana. Why we have used this population density and distance to Thana? First of all, I would say that this is definitely a very challenging task to identify the instruments, proper instruments, because banking firms and enterprise firms both are profit maximizing firms. So the same situations may influence the both. So we have to find out something which is very difficult to, I think, disentangle from this situation. But we tried in a sense that population density in an area is an indicator of business and marketing of an area. At the same time, population density gives an idea about the local area situation, like in terms of poverty, in terms of infrastructure and other things. A low densely populated area might be better in terms of other infrastructural development and other things, rather than highly densely populated area. With these two instruments, we also add two more. One is per capita loan in an area, in a thana, which is highly related to bank branch, but not related to branch directly, because it is divided by the population. And at the same time, we have used lagged number of bank branches. For example, we are using the data of 2013. We have used number of bank branches of 2010 in that thana, because the existing situation will help decide farm banks to expand its branches in that area. So these are the main, I think, intuitive explanation of why did we use these two or four instruments. So here we have shown the first stage regression results. You will see that log of distance is negative. Also log of population density is negative. That means lower population density promotes bank branch growth. Also, if distance is lower than lower to Dhaka, then it also improves growth of branches. And at the same time, I think all are negative. Negative in a sense, all are significant also. So our main concern is whether they are significant or not. The negative sign we can explain in many ways. So that is why we have used this uh, indicators instruments. So finally, the results is like this. If you see, I have not shown the whole regression because it includes farm characteristics, it includes Thana characteristics and other things. So finally, we see that a 1% growth of bank branch increases revenue of farms by about 3%. And also, this 1 and 2 uses different types of instruments. First one uses distance and population density. Then we added 2 more with log of bank branch in 2010. And this is what we have done. Also, per capita loan, we have added, perhaps it is not mentioned here. But we did not see any big changes with the inclusion of different types of instruments. And the test results are shown here: under identification, weak identification test, over identification test, and endogeneity test. All these identification provides that these are good instruments, at least technically. So in that sense, we see that our hypothesis is so far consistent with what we have developed in our theoretical model. So bank branch expansion could have eased the access to finance for SMEs, and as well as it improves their performances. So the results and conclusion, as I said, bank branch growth is positive and significant to farm output and labor productivity. A 1% growth of bank branch in a Thana will increase the farm's output as well as labor productivity by about 2 to 3%. The findings are consistent with our theoretical framework. The probability of default risk reduces with branch network expansion, and therefore better farms get access to credit at a reasonably lower rate. Thus, easy access to loans improves the farm's revenue and productivity and makes them more competitive. The findings of this study call for a specific plan and incentive mechanism for formal banks to expand their services to more subnational disaggregated level. This is the main policy implication of this paper. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Monzur. We'll move on to the third presentation by Iqbal. It's not from the same set of survey data that Kazi Iqbal dealt with, but it's another study on SME for the SME Foundation, focusing on women entrepreneurship.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Chair. As we observed, the two discussions presented on SMEs. One is focusing on cluster and non-cluster, another is financing issue. But my paper is pretty focused on SMEs, which is women entrepreneurship in SMEs in Bangladesh perspective. This study is supported by SME Foundation, and this is a co-authored paper. Another two author is Dr. Nazneen Ahmed and Monzur Hossain. So outline of my presentation will be women in the discussing about women in the labor force and study background and survey design, profile of the women entrepreneurs, characteristics of the enterprise, access to finance and credit, and after discussing the gaps in the policy and practice, and then conclusion. So why women entrepreneurship is important? Entrepreneurship capacity can achieve economic independence of women, overcome poverty through asset building, and improve their well-being as well as their families. From the literature, it is found that SME women entrepreneurs employ more women entrepreneurs, roughly 70% more than male. And another study found that women also tend to use their income more productive way, financing in human capital development. So enhancing these women entrepreneurship can create more capable to achieve the sustainable development goals. So what is the status of women in the labor force? Women in Bangladesh have progressed notably in terms of participation in the labor force from 16% in 1996 to 36% in 2016. According to the economic census data, 5.9% of the entrepreneurs are female. And it also, these statistics, if we compare with the previous round of economic census, 2001 and 3, we can see that this rate was 3.1%. So what is the background of this paper? So SME Foundation conducted a comprehensive study in 2009 to examine the status of women entrepreneurs in different sectors and also try to identify the obstacle that women are facing. So in that study, they found that women are the major obstacle that women are facing to access to finance. And in addition to that, they also facing the problem with marketing their product and training, and also how to manage the business and skilled labor. And we also see the literature before 2009. Those studies also highlighted that the access to finance and startup capital and business management and lack of skilled worker, these are the main problem facing by the women entrepreneurs. Since 2009, various policies and programs have been adopted by the government, like including the SME loan for the women entrepreneurs and women development policy and national skill development policy. So, and SME Foundation also took some policies and programs to improve the efficiency and productivity of women empowerment. So after this intervention, it is now time to explore the current situation of the women entrepreneurship development and design appropriate intervention of the policy on the basis of those findings. So in this, with this aim, the current study is initiated in 2017. So the main objective of this study is to explore the current status of women entrepreneurs working in the various sectors and identify those identify the factors that enhance the success of their those successful entrepreneurs, and also find out the obstacle faced by the women entrepreneurs currently. So data and methodology, and to achieve these objectives, we conduct both qualitative and quantitative approach. We surveyed 1,500 women entrepreneurs from covering all division and 45 districts. And we also conducted 6 FGDs of the women entrepreneurs at the division level, and 7 case studies of successful entrepreneurs who won the SME Foundation Prize in different years. So where we get these sample SME entrepreneurs? So SME Foundation, they published one document called SME Entrepreneur Directory 2015. And this directory has more than 7,000 women entrepreneur list. And in addition to that, we collected a women entrepreneur list from district level from the Women Association Chamber. From those lists, we randomly collected the sample SME entrepreneurs. So the proportion we followed, SME Women Director 2015, gives us the proportion of the different sectors. So we followed that proportion to find out the sample from each sector. So as I said, we covered 45 districts and to find out these 1,500 women entrepreneurs. And if we divide these women entrepreneurs in by nature of business, most of them are trading. They are doing the trading business. And by sector, you can see from the right-hand side table, the women are mostly concentrated on handicrafts, agro-based business, tailoring, beauty parlor, retail shop, etc. And if we compare this sectoral analysis in 2009, in the 2009, and most of the women entrepreneurs also concentrated in this major sector, but in 2017, we found that women are also entering some capital-intensive sector like electronics, software development, leather, etc. So what is the, now I will go to the profile of the women entrepreneurs. Who are the women are working as entrepreneurs? So most of the women are in their 30s or 40s, and they are mostly married. And having 1/5 of them having children less than 5 years. So you can see that marital status is almost 98% are married. So because of this, our intuition is young women, they prefer salaried job compared to say self-employed. And also another thing is the unmarried women, they face the problem with startup capital. But the married women, they have less problem to get the startup capital. And educated women are now increasingly preferring business compared to in 2009. Now, 27% of the women entrepreneurs are having tertiary education, means graduate and above. And around 80% of the current women entrepreneurs, they have no economic activities experiences before coming this business. And about 34% of the women entrepreneurs, they receive the relevant training before entering this specific business. Business network and management, 65% of the women entrepreneurs come from business-oriented families, either from the husband side or from the parent sides. And it is interesting that 10% of the women entrepreneurs are coming from the business-oriented family, the same as husband or parents are doing. And it also evident that 80% of the women entrepreneurs, they are managing their business by themselves, and rest 20%, either they are managing their business jointly with their husband or son or other family members. So who are the more dependent? So trading enterprise compared to manufacturing or service are more dependent for their, in case of their raw materials collection or marketing the product. And urban women are less dependent compared to the rural women. So when we compare the motivating factor in 2009 and 2017, we see that motivating factor also shifted from meeting the family necessities to empowering herself. And social norm and attitude are big problem for women to become entrepreneur, which has been improved in Bangladesh last 1 decade. In 2009 survey, it shows that 53% of the entrepreneurs, they said before coming to the business, either husband or mother-in-law, father-in-law, or any of the family member, they do not like she to go to the business. But these things improved. In 2017, only 16% women entrepreneurs reported that they face this problem from the family. And on the other hand, 41% women entrepreneurs, they say they face any kind of difficulty or dissatisfaction from the other relatives or society, which was 80% in 2009. What is the characteristics of the enterprise and sectors where the women are working? So women-owned firms are found in all sectors of the economy. Through they are more likely to concentrate in the trading and or trading base and cottage or micro industries. The majority of the firm have less than 10 employees with higher female concentration. So you can see this left side graph that on an average, manufacturing sector employs 71 employees, and these women entrepreneurs hired 85% of the employees who are female. Informality and the length of the women business. In the literature, it is shown that the enterprise run by the women are mostly informal or they are less experienced. But in the study in 2017, we found that 98% of the women entrepreneurs, they got trade license, and 56% of them have TIN number, and 47% they have battery station, and 78% they have showrooms for their product. So if we compare with the 2009 and 2070s, we can see the degree of formality has improved a lot in 2017. Maybe this is because of the SME loan Bangladesh Bank is giving. because to access those loans, you have to be formal, like having trade license and TIN number. So investment and sources. Over the time, women entrepreneurs relied on more institutional credit sources. Say in 2009, 7.3% of the women entrepreneurs taking institutional loan for their working capital, which is 25% in 2007, sorry. And bank account, 97% of the women, female entrepreneur in all sectors, they have bank account, and among them, 47% have a joint account with their husband or business partner. And overall, 58% of the women entrepreneurs, they have applied for SME loan, and 92% of them receiving it. In the literature, we found that before 2009, that it was the most highlighted problem, that access to finance. But now, the access to finance is not such kind of problem, because now, whenever a women entrepreneur applied, the probability of getting loan is 0.92%. And also, but now is another problem emerging. That is the inadequate amount of credit. Most of the women entrepreneurs, they reported that the current SME loan amount is not adequate for their business expansion. So they mentioned about that their collateral requirement and constraining accessing finance. And it is found that as we mentioned in the previous slide, that 58% they applied for the loan. The rest of the women entrepreneurs, they rely on non-institutional or their personal sources. They said that they do not know about regarding the banking system. They have lack of knowledge, and also they cannot develop their business plan properly so that they can apply for loan. So we said that one of the objective of our study to find out the determinants of the entrepreneur success. So in the literature, entrepreneur success can be defined in 3 ways. It's individual profit making, or social success, that means employment generation, and third is productivity. So we run this regression with some similar variable, and I will go to the result. So the first model for the profit, we see that human capital variable, that is education and training, self-management of the business, prior experience, are more important determinant for making more profit. And another way, human capital, age, experience, level of asset. These are the most important variable for creating more employment. And the productivity issue, those who have social capital, that means any of their family member are in the business, they have more probability to be having more higher productivity. So this was the result from the quantitative study. We also ask this question in the focus group discussion and other discussion, and they mentioned that women entrepreneurs, those women are more successful who have control over their business, and they having the power to decide what to do in their business plan. So ICT and trade fair opens new horizon for women entrepreneurs. We can see 2009 and 17. Now women are more engaging their business into ICT, and trade fair participation of trade fair enhances their business in terms of product quality and marketing access to market. So I will just briefly discuss about the study findings. What are the major challenges faced by the women entrepreneurs? In general, they are facing the problem with startup capital, product marketing, using the e-marketing, use of internet, and handling managing their business. And regarding the financing issue, inadequate credit limit. And another thing is promoting market. They have limited market access, poor quality of the product, and networking opportunities. So the gaps in the policy, I just mentioned about one thing. Bangladesh Bank has a policy that 15% of the SME loan has to be give the women entrepreneur, which is now around 4%. So, and another thing is collateral issue below 25 lakhs. It is mentioned that women entrepreneur need not to provide collateral, but in the practice it exists. So, what is the conclusion and policy suggestion? So our suggestion is to women entrepreneurs should receive adequate amount of credit facilities along with a 3-month grace period. And as the authorities like SME Foundation and other government authority should sensitize the bank official and organizing awareness raising program at different level to support the women entrepreneur, and organizing frequent trade fair in district level. In this case, women association members have a vital role, and women-friendly markets should be developed at the district level. And SME Foundation can organize more training, focusing how to manage their business and managing their account, and also the product development issues. And in the long run, we have to emphasize on the technical education, same as general education for creating sustainable job opportunities as well as entrepreneurship among the women. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Iqbal. We have discussing Dr. Shubhasish Barua. He is Assistant Professor, Department of Development Studies. I didn't introduce the others because everybody was from the BIDS. So, Shubhasish, we'll try to patch that up in 10 minutes. Then we go for floor discussion. We don't engage in the discussion on defining SMEs here.
Thank you, dear Chair. And thank you, ladies and gentlemen. And thank you, BIDS, for inviting me as a discussant in this important session. So what I will do, so this is the second time I have the privilege to be here at BIDS Research and ALMANAC, and I will try to exploit that advantage as much as possible. So firstly, I have 3 papers to discuss. As I always do, I try to find detailed remarks or comments on each of these papers. Though I don't have access to full paper for the two of the presenters, but I do have access to one paper, full paper. So what I will do, I will start with the first paper that is being presented by Dr. Kazi Iqbal, and his written and we co-authoring with his with Zabid Iqbal and Kazi Ali Toufique and Nahid Ferdous. Okay. So what I will do, I will go slide by slide with each of these papers. So I will start with Kazi Iqbal's paper. So this paper actually looks at the difference between performance of clustered and non-clustered SMEs. Okay, so you know, industrial clustering is an important determinant of having efficiency at the level of the industry. Okay. So, as the author has mentioned, by clustering farms, small farms can take infrastructural advantage of having access to input market at the low cost, having access to output market at a low cost. So there are a lot of advantage of being in the cluster. Okay. So as I said, I will go slide by slide. The first slide is the motivation. That is fine. Second slide is cluster-based SMEs. And that is also fine. Then I will start at page 3, okay? What are the 2 research questions? The author looks at the difference between clustered SMEs and non-clustered SMEs. So, and then has a specific question, whether the clustered SMEs are more productive and whether there is any Marshallian externalities present in this setup, okay? So, okay. So the third question is about the third session is literature review, and fourth is sampling. Okay, the first thing is that this is an important part of the study because this is a survey-based sample, and it's just a cross-section survey. So we need to know how the sampling is actually being done. whether I can see that samples are allocated by sectors, okay, and between clustered and non-clustered SMEs. So in order to have a precise estimation of the coefficients, we need and compare between SMEs across within cluster across within sector across cluster. We need to have the sample size estimated individually for each cluster and for each sector separately, okay? And what I can see here, we have 250 sample, and that is being, that starts from as small as 7 in handicrafts and miscellaneous sector to as large as 44 in leather, okay? So if you have too a small number of farms for a sector, then it will create noise, because at the end of the day, you have to estimate productivity and you have to compare the various performance across farms, okay? So you need to clarify on the determinants of sample size. Second is next slide on page 4. So you have compared between clustered and non-clustered SMEs in terms of their capital stock and employment, okay? So as far as the table is concerned, what I understood is that you have a mean of capital stock for clustered and non-clustered SMEs, and then you have total employment for clustered and non-clustered SMEs. Ideally, what I would have done in this case, I would have run a log of capital regression on sector dummies and then the clustered dummies. So the coefficient of the clustered dummies will give us the difference between mean of capital stock between cluster and non-cluster. So if you don't control for sector-specific dummies, then the difference in mean is not very meaningful to us, okay? Then I have slide 5, okay? And in slide 5, we have access to credit, okay? And we found that clustered SMEs have access to credit bank loans, okay? And non-clustered SMEs have access to credit from NGOs, okay? The question is, why do clustered SMEs have more access to bank credit? Is it, as one of the presenters have showed, is it because banks find it more efficient for providing loans to clustered SMEs, or whether this is the way you have selected the clusters? Probably one reason could be, I can see the source of bias could be, you have selected the cluster is located near the growth poles where most of the banks are located. So we need to understand that story a bit, okay? And then we have technology adoption side. The interesting thing is that in technology adoption, we don't see any difference between clustered and non-clustered SMEs in the last 5 years. This is very surprising to me, because if you look at the capital stock, where we see that clustered SMEs are significantly higher, have significantly higher capital stock, mean capital stock than non-clustered SMEs. And when it comes to the question of technology adoption, we found that there is no significant difference between the two groups. So that is why you should think about the regression and things like that, and how we should actually analyze the things. Okay. Then we have formalities. I'm not going to talk much about that. Then it comes to the TFP estimation. Okay. The problem here is that, as you mentioned, there is a problem of endogeneity in selections. Okay, so I have already have a slip from the chair. So TFP, okay. Okay. So TFP, TFP, I doubt whether the TFP should be the right measure of performance in this context, because you have only access to cross-section data and you don't have much sample per sector. Ideally, what I would have done in this case, I would have measured TFP at the sector level, because the coefficients of labor and capital differs from sector to sector. If you don't address the sector-specific TFP, then that will again be a source of bias. And another surprising this is that in slide 7, you have the TFP regression on technology and the size of the labor. All these coefficients are negative. This is very surprising to me, actually. Why this should be negative? I expect some positive signs here. And I think I have enough. I have more comments on your paper. Last year, I have sent some of these comments to you, and I can do this year as well. So I should move on to the next paper. I think this paper, by Monzur, Hossain, and co-authors, Local Financial Development, is an interesting one. The strength of the paper is that it has an analytical model, and it has a instrumental variable estimation strategy. The problem is that in both the cases, you have to have a story to convincing enough that that shows the strength of your estimation techniques, okay? So I would, in your literature review, I was looking for 2 famous papers that I know, and you all, most of you probably know, one is Stiglitz-Weiss paper on asymmetric information the paper title is Asymmetric Information and Credit Rationing. Credit Rationing in Market with Asymmetric Information. And the second paper is Too Much Investment, a Problem of Asymmetric Information. So you, in your motivation, you talked about asymmetric information, why it matters for firms' credit growth and access to credit. So asymmetric information, as Dimaza and Wave have showed, criticizing the Stiglitz-Weiss paper, may not only ration credit, but in contrast, it can actually lead to overinvestment. So Dimaza showed that asymmetric information, unlike Stiglitz and Weiss, can lead to overinvestment. So when we talked about branching, that branch growth and higher, and you mentioned in your story that if there is higher competition between banks, they will look for good borrowers. But Dimaza and Wave suggested that good borrowers will bring in bad borrowers in this setup. So that will actually increase the credit risk. So you need to have a look at these papers and understand this. Second is the IV. So in IV estimation, in instrumental variable estimation, you need to have a story that will tell us that your instruments actually satisfy exclusion restrictions. By exclusion restriction, what I mean here is that you use population density and distance from capital as an instrument. So the problem here is that firms will also try to locate near to the capital city, and the banks also try to locate near to the capital city. So if you use distance from capital as the instrument, you can see that both the firm's behavior and the bank's behavior are influenced by these 2 factors. So what else you can do? I have another route of thinking to this is that think about bank branch growth over time, over the last 20 years. So we have a huge remittance growth across rural areas. So banks locate in rural areas where there is a chance of collecting higher amount of deposits. So collection of deposits, the bank's interest of collection of deposit is separate from farm's interest to locate in a growth poles. So if you use migration network or the infrastructure for migration network as an instrument for selection of bank, I think that will actually give you a better framework, better instrument, okay? And then I would like to have a last comment. So when you have showed the instrumental variable IV estimation, actually you need to show us the OLS and then IV so that we can understand the bias that is emanating from, okay? So I have still few more comments on your paper, then I will leave it for our informal discussion. And finally, on the women entrepreneurship paper. So I would like to address one point made by the presenter. He said married female have higher access to startup capital. So what we hear from our friends and colleagues, those who are working in women entrepreneurship, is that actually it is their husband who actually manage these farms and manage this credit for the farms named under women's. Okay, So women, to what extent we are facilitating women entrepreneurship in Bangladesh need to be rethought. And finally, just half minute on regression, okay? So you have used employment, profitability, and productivity as performance indicator. What I will see, employment is not a performance or success indicator of a firm, so you should drop it. And if you look at your profitability and employment and productivity regression, there is a huge difference between the coefficient in profitability and productivity regression. I don't see much source of that difference between these two regression because these are coming from the same variables. I think you also need to think about the how you should measure. And all these three papers actually can work with the labor productivity because they all are working with the cross-section data. And thank you very much.
I shall request Shubhasish to pass his detailed comments to the authors later on. I'll take 2-3 minutes and then leave it to the floor for raising questions or any significant observation that you may have. I'm trying to substitute Bashar, Dr. Syed Bashar. So on the women paper, I think there isn't any control group that you can aim that this thing. That's point one. Point two is, I believe one of the major observation is the social inhibition in employment. But that was perception based, and I think there is a lot of things that you can take cue from. And I would say, Shubhasish, that don't believe in hearsay. People say many things, but things have changed. So there are studies that you have to refer to. Is it women who are borrowing for finance husbands? I think things have changed, and most of the empirical studies have actually signaled that kind of change. Now, one thing I suggested before is because it's all women focused, if it's possible to look into comparing across sectors. I mean, what kind of differences in entrepreneurship that you find in participation across sectors, maybe in terms of age group, in terms of marital status, in terms of any other thing. There are certain activities which are not still considered to be, women friendly, whereas some others may be. And you could possibly from your data find more interesting things. I have two major questions, one each to Iqbal and Kazi Iqbal and the other to Monzur. To Kazi, the issue of cluster, I believe there has been a natural development of cluster, and it was nice to see that the issue of transport sharing came out to be a major significant thing, whereas some other variables did not come out. And that's what pursuing, giving some more thoughts that why this natural clustering took place and sounded more agrarian than the industrial kind of society. Agrarian in the sense that we still pull in all kind of agricultural produce on the roadside and then avail the common transport facilities. So there is something in the characteristics of the activities where this kind of clusters, the activities which take place in this kind of clusters, which are possibly different from the kind of modern industrialization that we are thinking of. That takes me to also trying to find out the difference between clustering as an intervention instrument, which you see in a different form in case of economic zoning, and that addresses primarily the infrastructure which are brought in, and also the government services that have to be provided through kind of pseudo one-stop services, which can be contrasted with the cluster that you're dealing with. To Monzur, I think something Shubhasish wanted to pick at. I'm trying to tell the story differently, because you have an assumption of banks maximizing profit. And one would think that the attributes of potential clients, borrowers from the banks, are independent of the supply side variables. If that is so, how would supply actually change that characteristic and change the premium and change everything? Now, it's not a single market. I think this is where you may like to revisit the issues. It's not a single market because we are moving on to another market, expanding into another market, which have to be taken into account. And one would expect that if there was no compulsion to engage in other markets, people and the banks have generally tended in this country to concentrate in the urban commercial areas. And that has been the trend. And that also tells you why they wouldn't go for it. Now, the kind of results that you get can be actually explained in a different way in terms of with fixed interest rate under the commercial bank system, there is a lot more incentive amongst bank officials to extract rate. This is, I'm saying that, which may then encourage in markets, in the marginal markets where the branches are being opened, where you have potential for rent seeking higher than what you get in the urban places. This is one possibility I'm saying, which may then push the total loan supply through that branches. And but the control variables somehow are not adequately addressed because there are so many other things happening in the settings where the branches are expanding with the digitization of financial services. I would suggest that some more thoughts be given before you come up with a conclusion which says that increase the number of branches to reach out, expand the financial inclusion and thereby growth. That seems to be a bit too dangerous a conclusion. I will leave it to the floor now. Please raise questions. Introduce yourself first. Minhas, please.
Thank you. I have a question for Monzur and also one for Iqbal. Dr. Monzur Hossain presented. So you presented a theoretical model and then empirical analysis. It's not clear what is the link between this theoretical modeling and your empirical analysis and strategy, because you show some first order conditions model and whether you're testing any hypothesis deriving from that. Do you test any testable prediction coming out of that model? And also the issue of instrument has been covered by the discussion, but maybe you can add more on the intuitive justification of the instrument. You say it is technically valid, although the discussant has raised that question also. For Iqbal Hossain, I see you are comparing 2009 data with 2017 data. So I'm just, probably I missed it. Are you comparing the same subsample from 2009? So yeah, so,
it's
so
a
those
different thing.
2017 is not in 2009 sample.
We take in few more questions.
Hello, Ahmed. Hello, Ahmed, Economics Department, North South University. A general observation across all three papers. An important area, of course, SME, and each paper points to policy implications. My general observation is this. If we just bluntly ask for government protection or policy intervention, we have to justify it. In one of the papers says protection of industry, protection from what? That we need to explain and why. And then policy incentives. What kind of policy incentives? This is my understanding. I would like to share with you. When there's a market failure, of course, it justifies government intervention. Some of the externalities can be internalized through market process, the one that you mentioned, learning by doing, and also sharing infrastructure and all that. That's fine. It can be internalized through market process. Government doesn't have to come in and do that unless there is incomplete information or the industry needs a nudge. So, and when these externalities cannot be internalized through market process, it can justify government intervention, policy intervention. But in that case, also we have to be mindful, the residual social benefits, how much does it cost? What is the policy cost to address that? If the policy cost is more than the social benefits we try to harvest, then it doesn't really make sense, economic sense. So, again, if it's incomplete information, it's infrastructure needs and all that where government intervention is warranted, it's fine. If the industry needs a nudge, it's fine. But we need to be mindful at what cost.
Thank you, Hilal. Basically, that's a general thing which possibly as researchers we ought to keep in mind, think through policies. Now that Kaji Ali Toufique.
Thank you. I'm going to comment on Monzur's paper. Actually, I expressed my opinion in many ways to him. In general, I'm really getting increasingly skeptic about learning from only data. You do some, control few things, find some relationship, and draw a conclusion like you increase bank branches, it reduces default rate, get good borrowers, and then revenue increases. I mean, okay, but I want to see more how this whole thing is derived. The discussant was referring to it, but possibly he did not elaborate that further, or maybe didn't get the time to do that. If he didn't get the time, maybe I'm helping him to get that.
But you have 1 more minute.
How much minute?
1 more. We are taking in questions for their benefits. You can exchange between yourselves later on. This gathering, it would be good to actually raise the questions, make the observations, and then if there is time, we can come back.
Okay, let's come to the point then. I mean, how do you argue that when number of branches increases, default rate falls because banks get to know the clients better? It can go opposite way. There is a competition for clients. You might pick up a client who will default, knowing that your default rate might increase. It's an empirical question. Rather than saying that increasing branches decreases that, you need to establish that from empirical thing, because that's the key assumption of this thing. The second thing, in Bangladesh, the problem is the government is increasing branches in the rural areas. The branches are getting deposits, but rechanneling back to urban areas. So you may increase branches, they might give loan or whatever the profit, or from at least from the deposit. In numbers, in your data, you'll see there are a lot of banks, but they're actually rechanneling the funds to urban areas. So these things, or even when there is a pressure, if you have agent type kind of analysis in this model, the lender, if you have a principal agent problem, the bank might think that if they have to expand to SMEs, the agent will now carry on, like if he has a target, he has to meet a target. This supports my first argument. He will give loan to back borrowers. You might end up with lemons, for example, asymmetric information problem. The other thing that I don't understand, I can understand when the bank, when the borrowers get access to credit, their revenue can increase. They may run on the same production function, but not different technology. How does productivity increases with higher credit?
Okay, thank you. We'll go for a quick response. If there isn't any other question, clarification? Iqbal on the survey? No.
Thank you. I will respond to two observations. One is the husband is the main management. So we have also the same similar intuition before going to the survey. When we do the real survey, before that we do the pre-testing, and that time we found that some of the women entrepreneurs, the business are managing by their husband. Then we come up with a new question, one table that in different section, who is responding those questions? Are the women entrepreneur or her husband? Then the enumerator put the number of which section is answered by who.
Don't get into the details, but basically there was a question between, I don't think you compare
the second one,
and 17.
Minhas by question. Then Actually, we do not have access to the 2009 data, or, although it was said that we have to, we will get that. But we compare on the basis of the report 2009, some indicators.
Thank you. Monzur.
থ্যাংক ইউ। আমি প্রথমে লিন্টু বইটটা দিয়ে একটু শুরু করি যে ডিফল্ট রিস্ক বাড়া এবং কমা দুই দিকেই কিন্তু কম্পিটিশন বাড়ার সাথে এটা লিটারেচারে আছে, যে এটা ব্যাড বড়োয়ারও হতে পারে, গুড বড়োয়ারও হতে পারে। যেহেতু আমরা থিওরিটিক্যালি এটা দেখাচ্ছি ডিফল্ট রেট কমলে লোন ডিমান্ড বাড়ছে, এটা একটা আর্গুমেন্ট যে রিলেশনশিপ ব্যাংকিং আমি যেটাই বলি তাদের সাথে ক্লোজ ইন্টারাকশন সিমেট্রি অফ ইনফরমেশন যদি কমে যায় তাহলে সেটা হতে পারে যে ডিফল্ট রিস্ক কমাটাই সম্ভাবনা বেশি, ইফ দেয়ার ইজ এ কেস। এখন অল্টারনেটিভ হতেই পারে, সেটা ডিপেন্ডস অন দ্য আই থিঙ্ক আনঅবজার্ভ ক্যারেক্টারিস্টিক্স অফ ব্যাংক ম্যানেজার্স অ্যান্ড আদার থিংস। এটা যদি কন্ট্রোল না করা হয় ইট মাইট হ্যাপেন। তো সেদিক থেকে ওই আর্গুমেন্টটাকে আমরা এখানে এস্টাবলিশ করার চেষ্টা করিনি, বাট ইট ইজ ট্রু। এবং আপনি যেটা বলছেন যে কিভাবে রিলেশনশিপ ব্যাংকিং এইসব এই অংশটা আমাদের স্কোপের মধ্যে আমরা রাখিনি, কারণ লটস অফ লিটারেচার আর দেয়ার, আমরা জাস্ট রেফার করেছি। দিস ইজ ওয়ান থিং। বাট আপনার যে লাস্ট কোয়েশ্চেনটা, দ্যাট ইজ ইন ওয়ান ওয়ে উই আর ট্রাইং টু সে লেবার প্রোডাক্টিভিটি কীভাবে বাড়ে। যেহেতু আমি ব্যাংক ভেরি ক্লোজ টু ফার্মস, এবং তাদের একটা যেটা আপনি বলছেন এজেন্ট না হলে তার মনিটরিং এটা অনেক বেড়ে যায় ফার্মের উপর, এবং তাদের এফিসিয়েন্সিটা তারা বাড়াতে হবে, যেহেতু দে ডোন্ট হ্যাভ টু বি ডিফল্টার। তাদেরকে সময় মতো ঋণ পরিশোধ করতে হবে এবং তাদের একটা প্রেশারে থাকবে, দেন দে ট্রাই টু ইমপ্রুভ দ্য productivity of labor in a sense that they have to find this. This is one of the arguments, one paper says like this. So এটা একটা যে মনিটরিং এবং এফিসিয়েন্সি আর্গুমেন্টে এটা হতে পারে। আর জাস্ট একটু শুভাশিসের কথা একই রকম, ওই ইনস্ট্রুমেন্ট নিয়ে কথা থাকবে, যেটা আমিও বলছি যে ইটস এ ভেরি ডিফিকাল্ট টু ফাইন্ড দিস কাইন্ড অফ ভ্যালিড ইনস্ট্রুমেন্ট, বাট অ্যাট দ্য সেম টাইম যেটা আমরা বলছি যে আরেকটু কিছু চেষ্টা করা যেতে পারে, বাট অ্যাটলিস্ট ঢাকার কাছে কেন একটা প্রশ্ন সাজাদ ভাই আমি জাস্ট একটু বলতে চাই যে আসলে ব্যাংক কাকে টার্গেট করে? ব্যাংক টার্গেট করে লার্জার ফার্মসকে, নট ওই স্মল ফার্মকে টার্গেট করে সে কিন্তু কোনো জায়গায় যায় না। সুতরাং আমার ওইখানে যদিও বা এটা আর্গুমেন্টের প্রেক্ষিতে আমরা বলতে পারি যে ব্যাংকের সাথে একটা অ্যান্ডোজেনাস প্লেসমেন্টের ব্যাপার আছে, কিন্তু অ্যাটলিস্ট আসলে এসএমই-কে টার্গেট করে ব্যাংক যায় না, দ্যাট ইজ ফর শিওর। সুতরাং ওই জায়গাটাতে আমরা অ্যাটলিস্ট উই ক্যান গেট সাম relaxation from
Monzur, thank you, but I think there is a lot more to think through regarding what Toufique raised, and also I think the banks have increasingly moved to target SMEs. I mean, whatever they see, it has been 25% that.
Okay. Thank you. Thanks, Shubhasish, for your detailed comments. Your first question about the sampling. We use the stratified sampling to reflect the heterogeneity of the clusters, their size, and also the sectors. So this is well done. So there is not a problem. And why clustered SME have access to the bank credit? I think formality have a big role because they have some registration. It is not due to sampling bias. Then you asked about the technology adoption versus capital stock, because the capital stock is high, why technology adoption is gone, but it is only for the last 5 years. Maybe before 5 years, they accumulated that capital. We don't have that information with us. TFP at the sector level, we wish we could estimate TFP at the sector level, but for some sectors, we have very small observation that we cannot estimate. Regarding Sajjad bhai's comment, it's between the difference between the cluster and the industrial park. The clusters are created endogenously. The farms to locate next to each other. Whereas in case of industrial park, it is like the government or the private sector, they develop a land and invite other farms to come in. But in the industrial park, it may or may not be of the same product.
The reason I raised that question is, when you are suggesting that clustering should be an instrument to promote SME growth, then you are actually pushing your thing.
Exactly, I am coming to that point. So in case of industrial park, it is the heterogeneous farms. It's not the similar farms. And when it is not similar farms, the type of externality, the Marshallian externality that we talk about, sharing, learning, and matching, might not be to that extent. Because when two similar farms are next to each other, the probability that they learn from each other is higher than two dissimilar or two different type of farms are there. But in case of transport, that farms can transport, even if they are not similar farms. So, bottom line would be, even in case of industrial park, there might be some Marshallian externalities, but not as much as the cluster. And in case of protection that you raised, it's like an infant industry argument. Some farms are engaged in some price discovery. They are learning. They are doing something new thing that might need some government protection. In this case also, they are helping each other. They are trying to grow each other. They are trying to go together. So in this case, it can also protect them. So that that can exploit the positive externality of the farms. Thank you.
We'll take a quick round of very urgent questions and clarifications if you have any, because we are close to 3:30, right? And moreover, I think within clusters, there are between farm exchanges which compel them to actually. Shubhasish with an answer, but no question.
In regard to Dr. Kazi Ali Toufique's query on the link between bank branch growth and productivity, okay? So idea is that farms are credit constrained, okay? And by relaxing the credit constraints of the farm, you are providing credit to the farms so that they can invest in productivity, improving technology. So if the farms are allowed to invest in productivity, improving technology, then there is a increase in productivity. Thank you.
Yeah, but I think Kazi Ali Toufique. Yeah, I think Kazi Ali Toufique had a point. He says that directly, saying whether the technology. So the questions are basically very hard to assume that the bank is profit maximizing. You're having loans given to inefficient groups, whereas there are less risky people, not counterintuitive, unless you start off with an assumption of. Anyway, thank you.